Hello. So today I want to make a video regarding a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I haven't really been able to kind of articulate my thoughts on it. And who knows, I may not be able to accomplish that today, but I'm going to try. What is it like to live in New Mexico? This kind of came up after talking with an acquaintance of mine about communal living and people's expectations, especially as they get older. A lot of the older folks that move out here and what they want to accomplish, and maybe what is realistic, out here versus what is kind of a pipe dream. So, um, let's start with this idea of greening the desert, right? So a lot of people, and this is something I think that started with the Mormons in Salt Lake City. They were kind of the pioneers of this idea that you could turn the desert green if you just managed nature just right and moved the water around just right. You could turn the desert green and turn it into like a tropical paradise. Well, the reality is it's still the desert. You can't undesert the desert, it turns out. And you can grow some food. You can have some animals, some livestock, whatever. You can build some houses. But these mega cities that we've built in the desert, in the southwest of the U.S., they're not especially practical, and it's being discovered more and more that that is the case. And so, let's go over some of that. I mean, first off, the amount of water that's had to be moved around just to get to where we are today is extraordinary. We've, been in this situation where we're essentially out of water in New Mexico and Arizona since the 60s, 70s, since people first started really aggressively moving out here with the advent of, affordable, reasonably affordable air conditioning. White people started, Anglos started moving here in droves, and it, before that, people basically it was mostly Hispanic people and people with some skin pigment that could handle some of this heat. And people that just were already adapted to this environment, had generations here that would move here. Um, and ever since we've started really colonizing this, it's been difficult, and mostly due to water. Another issue, is groundwater depletion, right? So a lot of people, most of the communities in the Southwest that aren't along a river or canal utilize groundwater, right? And groundwater in these environments is generally a very limited resource, even if it wasn't as non-renewable as it is, given as deep as it is, and how slowly it recharges. Example, water in our area is said to be 10,000 years old at least. So it's essentially, considered fossil water. And there's older water under, much of New Mexico and Arizona and the Southwest. And so, utilizing that resource, you're utilizing a finite resource. People have had this mistaken idea that's been proven incorrect many times, that scientifically proven that it's not true at all, and it was just a story that was made up by real estate developers and ranchers, wishful thinking you might call it, that there were inexhaustible groundwater resources underneath much of the Southwest. Turns out there really isn't. In fact, a lot of it's severely limited. Where I live right now, is said to have between like 25 to 50 years of water remaining. Um, Development has slowed, and if development slows down, that water will probably last longer. But at the rate of development that we've seen up to this point, the kind of average, we're looking at 30 years, 50 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. And so that's extremely unsustainable. So, you talk about, that people have had so much trouble having a place for their children to live. My generation is seeing it that we're almost out of water now. And, you know, to my the way I would perceive that situation is that we have already been out of water for quite some time because we didn't have enough water to sustain ourselves to begin with. Um, once the population hit over a few million people in the Southwest, there was never any conceivable way that we would make it work long term. Now, California is in a different situation. Southern California is different because Southern California can desalinate ocean water. Worst case scenario, solar desalination. They have an option. They have a like a emergency backup plan. The desert Southwest, at least at this time, does not have an emergency backup plan, and there's been talk of this magic device that is essentially a giant dehumidifier that supposedly captures fog and or water from the air. The problem is you can't capture water from air that is sitting at 0% humidity, and we don't get dew even quite often because we're sitting at 0% humidity. So what you're going to harvest, what little water we do have that's in the air, it's already so dry here that people get itchy, they get nosebleeds. I get my skin gets funky. My partner, she has a lot of skin issues here. It's super common because it's so dry. And so, talking about harvesting water from air that is so dry that human skin doesn't like it. And I'm really well adapted to handling the sun. I can go out, be in the New Mexico sun, and I don't burn. My partner, she does burn. But, that doesn't stop me from getting so dry that I'm uncomfortable. And I've also lived off grid for an extended period of time. I know how to stay sane when it's extremely dry. But you're not going to harvest water from this air. It's not practical. I think the most practical solution we might be able to do like desalination of the groundwater. So like pull brackish groundwater and desalinate it. Pull the super alkaline water and just remove the alkaline, the salts and minerals from it. So what we have here is very alkaline water. It's I believe high pH. I think it's like 11, a pH of like 11 or 11 and a half is our groundwater. The water that, when we turn on the faucet, it's about 11 and a half pH, which makes it a little bit too alkaline to grow a garden very well. It is possible. The problem is you combine that with alkaline soil. So you have to really be specifically specializing in plants that like alkaline conditions. And there are food crops that will tolerate that, but they are not the things that we're used to eating. The things we're used to eating tend to enjoy acid soil and kind of more neutral pH, somewhere between acid and neutral. Alkaline tends to be kind of this no man's land where it's a little bit tough to grow food. Also, we have really heavy clay soil. So and I saw an episode of This Old House that was talking about gardening in New Mexico, and they were doing waffle gardens, which is a great way to do it. You dig kind of in like you essentially dig your garden into the ground a little bit. So, in wet climates, a lot of people talk about a raised garden bed, which is a really good way to do things in a wet climate because you give your soil somewhere to drain so it doesn't stay waterlogged. Here we have the opposite problem. So our soil does hold water to an extent, but the problem is it's so dry, the UV is so intense, and the air is so dry that our soil dries out. And also the water evaporates. And so one thing you can do is dig kind of a pit and essentially plant your plants in ground. That's what the waffle shape is, right? It looks like a waffle on the ground. and it does work, and that's what some of what we're doing out in our garden is a sort of a waffle modified version of that type of garden where we essentially have tilled in um, organic material and manure that's already been composted, and combine it with the native soil, and it's a little bit sunken in so that it'll collect water a little bit. The problem with that, still, our water's really alkaline, the soil's really alkaline, the fertilizer, the manure is a little bit alkaline. um, it's tough to get away from that alkaline element. You can shift the pH in the other direction, but it's tough. And then something I saw in that episode of This Old House, to bring it back to that, was they were adding sand, which is, why would you add sand? Because what's the recipe for adobe? Sand, clay, and straw, right? So they're essentially making a proto adobe in the ground and planting their plants into that. That sounds like an awful place for roots to, propagate. So I don't know who decided that that was going to be their reference point on This Old House for gardening in the Southwest, but that was pretty awful advice. Um, and that kind of gives you some idea of like how few people have actually come out here and said, made videos, for example. I found like one YouTube channel that was really focused on talking about what you need to do to garden here, and they made like 5 videos so far. That's it. And one of the big things they talk about is adding organic material. So we're really short on our organic material because it's a desert, right? And so we've actually got a lot of the metals that plants need. They're a little bit the concentration's a little bit off, but we do have them, and we have okay soil. It is usable for gardening. Great for potatoes. Great for peppers. But for a lot of things, you want to add organic material just to kind of help essentially break up that soil and give it a little bit of aeration, because the roots need to be able to go somewhere. Growing into a rock is not what most plants are adapted to doing. And so there's just a lot to it, right? And what it kind of all boils down to, right, is that people, they come from maybe more fertile places with a little bit milder climates, and they think, I'm going to do what I did there and it's going to work. Look at this cheap land. I can buy a cheap house with cheap land and it'll work. Most of the time it ends up being really expensive. You're terraforming essentially. It's like terraforming Mars. The sun is just brutal. The wind is very intense. My recent story is that I tried to build a wind block, right? And I put 4x4 posts in the ground. I put a fair bit of, put 60 pounds of concrete on each of them. I thought this will be fine. I put these privacy fence panels, I attached them to my posts. As soon as I had attached my privacy fence panels to my posts and they were sitting there, and I was like, cool, I did it. This is perfect. The wind blew, gusted really hard, and split the panels in half. I mean, it was like a joke. Like nature was laughing at me. It just split my privacy panels in half. They hit me in the face, and and knocked me over, and no more wind block. So because we do get, like, at least in my area, and we tend to be, by the way, where I live is one of the milder places in New Mexico. But still, that's the kind of winds we get. So you see on the USDA climate zone map that we're zone 6A or 6B or 7A, and you think, man, you could grow like a lot of the stuff people want to eat there, right? But what they don't tell you is it's a high desert. And a lot of the stuff just can't handle the wind, the UV, the dryness, the soil conditions. It's tough. It's a tough place, and it is possible. It is possible to garden here, but it is tough. It is not. It's an extreme sport. It's not something you just do. You just pick up and it just works out and everything's great. And so people come here with these crazy ideas, and they think it's cheap. Big misconception, right? All of our food comes here on a truck. That's expensive. And we have a little bit of local food here, but a lot of it comes on a truck or gets shipped in somehow. We import the majority of it, so that's quite expensive. Our fuel, it varies. It varies with the rest of the country. Fuel, if you have to pay for gas, it can be expensive or it can be cheap. It really depends. We do produce a fair bit, but we don't necessarily always get the benefit of that, because quite often there's other parties that, like a lot of the oil is conveniently located under tribal land, and unfortunately for the tribes, I don't want to get into all this, but let's just say that the oil does not always benefit the people here. When it's extracted, it usually goes somewhere else to be refined and utilized. And our internet infrastructure is not ideal, so we have very little uplink. So your upload speeds, they're getting better nowadays, but for a long time, absolute maximum upload you'd get from any internet connection here, you might get a 100 megabit download or even a gigabit download, but you'd only get like 1 megabit upload. Now it's starting to get better. But if that's important to you, being able to upload it, it used to take me like an hour to upload a short YouTube video, just because even with an expensive internet connection. Our internet does tend to be more expensive too. So the major carriers like Xfinity, Comcast, and CenturyLink, they price regionally, and we tend to have higher prices. The local carriers tend to be a bit better. The local wireless ISPs. I worked with one, and they were pretty good. There's one problem though, and the major problem is the wind. The wind tends to knock the antennas out of alignment, and so you need to get your antenna realigned quite often, or have it on a really sturdy mount so it doesn't move. And that's just the biggest thing here is wind. I mean, you can't use an asphalt roof here because the wind is so strong. Um, with our salty soil, you could have a T-post that just rots in the ground. Much like I've heard, from people in the tropics, that you put a T-post in the ground and it's so salty that it just rusts the thing right through. And galvanized tends to do a bit better. It's hard to find those here. A lot of the stuff that would be really useful here, you can't find it for some reason. Soil is, compost is actually kind of tough to find. Organic, high quality compost, it can be really expensive here. There's not that many bulk suppliers. There's one in Albuquerque, and a lot of people out here like to use them. Their name is Soilutions, and they're pretty good, but they're quite expensive for if you're having if your plan is to like terraform an entire acre, it might be kind of tough to do. A lot of people out here like to have horses, but there's not enough food growing, on the ground. It looks like there is. There's, this winter rye everywhere. There's not enough food here to feed them, so they have to buy hay, and then they also have to, pay for the water, and the water is not ideal quality. The water is, in fact, such poor quality, so alkaline, and contains things like uranium and strontium. It's not especially good water, and so it does things like cause stomach cancer. For our animals, we don't have livestock for this reason, or in part because of this. There's many reasons we don't have livestock right now, but one of the reasons is we don't want to deal with water for them. We water our animals, our pets, with drinking water that we purchase at 25 cents a gallon, which you'd think would be, it's not that expensive and you get used to paying it, but, it is something. If you had horses, that would not be very sustainable. And so, and that's another thing, we have to buy our drinking water. So, we have community water here. It's essentially a well at the top of the subdivision. There's pipes that carry that water throughout the subdivision, and we're all on acre lots, and we get to tap into that well. It's a really deep well. I don't even know exactly how deep it is. I think it's around 800 or 1,000 feet deep. That's a big thing. A lot of people see this really cheap raw land in New Mexico, and they think, I'm going to set up an off-grid homestead. I'm going to do water or rain catchment. I'm going to, maybe drill a well, all this stuff, but they don't think about the road to get to that land. They don't think about the lack of groundwater, or if there is groundwater, how deep it's going to be. They don't think about the quality of the water. They don't think about the lack of rainfall. Um, we used to get 15, maybe even close to 20 inches of rain a year here on average. Now we average somewhere around like 8, 10, maybe as low as nothing, in a year, or 2 inches in a year. We really can sometimes be in very severe drought, and it's pretty consistent that we're in somewhat of a drought compared to historical averages. These days, in the past 10, 15 years, it's been pretty consistent drought. And so it can be pretty tough to, figure out a sustainable water supply for yourself, just coming out of the sky. So, you have to supplement by hauling water. Well, that A, gets expensive, B, it's a pain, C, the water's not good quality, and D, it's not sustainable. You know, if development slows down a little bit, which it has slowed, I've noticed, with the real estate market has stayed red hot, but after the COVID has kind of cooled off, or just people have stopped worrying about COVID as much, I guess. Um, the real estate hasn't been quite as hot here, and so development has slowed a bit. But the thing is, we still don't have that much water supply left in the ground. And the river has always been stressed. In fact, there are multiple large projects. For example, there's the project to move Rio Chama water underground to essentially pipe it so that it will become a tributary of the Rio Grande further downstream so that it can supply farmers further downstream. And even that, was a time last year, right? It's very feast or famine. So like this year, the Rio Grande is like at its maximum level. Last year, it was dry. There was nothing in the river. And there's no system in place to manage that, to like say, okay, we stored river water this year, and then next year we let it flow. And part of that is, I think, New Mexico doesn't have a whole lot of allocation of this water. We split it. There's a thing called the Rio Grande Compact, a Rio Grande Compact, and we split it with other states, and so we have to ration this limited supply of water between multiple states. And as far as I know, the numbers that they originally came up with, just like all these other desert water compacts, we're nowhere near what the actual consistent flow is, and so at the end of the day, nobody gets their share of the water. So water is just such a major problem here, and it really limits, what you can do. The water's just not good quality. There's not enough of it, and so that takes this really cheap, beautiful land. It makes it a lot less usable for agriculture, for living on, and it's overdeveloped. I mean, there's way too many people in the desert considering what water supply is available. I know that a lot of places have become crowded, and trust me, I'm aware of it. I don't like being crowded, and it sucks. But we've become crowded, and we're running out of water. So we do have a lot of space. I think our population density on average is, don't quote me on this, but I'm going to say somewhere in the neighborhood of like 7 people per square mile or something. It's like next to nothing. It's very small. But the problem is, we don't have the water to sustain even that much population, and considering all the ranching and farming that we do, and the water-intensive things that still happen here, we still have the stupid people that want their golf courses in the middle of the desert. That not a dirt golf course, but a water, a grass golf course in the middle of the desert. And they will have it because they purchased the water rights for it from someone. They have those things, and it wastes water, and people there's a lot of cattle ranching, and people are really proud of the fact that we have local beef here, but it wastes a whole bunch of water. It's very water expensive. Statistically, I think it's like what, 10 gallons per pound of beef or something. I think it's more than that, but that's what I remember. And that's not sustainable, like at all here. Especially if there's concentrated animal feeding operations in the kind of more rural, isolated pockets of the state, and those places don't have enough water to sustain that. So um, there have been talks of building a giant pipeline to move water from somewhere and bring it here. But that also comes with its own host of issues. Look at what happened in California with the San Francisco Delta. You know what you know what where does it stop? The issues, they're relentless, right? And so I guess my caution to anyone wanting to move out here really would be to, for one thing, don't buy a sight unseen, right? Don't go buy a piece of land, online or whatever without going there first, because you might be buying something you can never get to. The area that we have, land in the forest. I made some videos about it. You'll see where we have obvious New Mexico forest, desert forest, trees and cactus, and it's beautiful. There was a lot of land in that area that it was completely inaccessible. It had a road on the map. You could see a path, something etched into the mountain. But it was, giant boulders, and it was going straight up a vertical cliff face, and you weren't going to get to it. Even hiking in would be a challenge. I used to have a Jeep YJ, 1994 Wrangler YJ, and that thing got stuck trying to get to one of those pieces of land. I had to winch myself out multiple times. I even had one situation where I had to leave it and hike down a hill and talk to somebody and have them help me get out. So it's no joke. Some of that land, it looks like it's in a subdivision. There might be a house down the road from it. The house, I don't know, there were neighbors to that land, and their driveway was, you had to go up a vertical cliff face to get to their driveway, and they lived there. And I talked to them, and they said, yeah, this road didn't used to be this bad, but it eroded away and whatever, and now it's like this. You just have to deal with it. And so, you know, what you see online and what you see, even if you visit in person, it can be really deceptive. I see some really beautiful places that I physically go to, and I always, now I kind of know, I remember, this intuition, it pops in. It's like, hey, what about the water situation here? What about the fire regime here? How often does this place burn? One thing about our land that you might have seen in the videos, it's a beautiful place. Don't get me wrong. Like, love it there. It was worth every penny, but it took a lot of time and effort to find that one spot that was, worth, and it was way more expensive than everything else I found. I found lots in that area for a quarter of what we paid for that land. But that land, was accessible, it has multiple roads that go to it. The roads are pretty good. It has water nearby, water mains if we want to tap into them. But it had burned recently. There's ash, or there's spots where you can tell it burned not too long ago. And so that's another element is how often does this place burn to the ground? And if you're in a place with no water and you're in the forest, or even in the juniper forest, maybe light pinon with a lot of juniper, that still burns. I mean, even the prairies burn. And that's normal. I mean, that's part of life here, is that things burn. And people, they move into a place and they think, I never want my house to burn down. And that's, reasonable to think that. The problem is they're moving into a place where it is part of nature to burn on a regular basis. So there's management, where on our property we got to thin out all the dead trees, and we got to get rid of all the undergrowth, and we got to clear it out as much as we can, but also, not kill the land. We want to have mulch on the ground so that things, so it holds some moisture, but we don't want it to burn. So we really have to put effort into managing our forest now. It's a whole separate task, and if there's a task that causes me to sell that land, Because for me, right, I like to be able to travel. I like to be able to go do things, and being stuck, always having to manage that land might burn me out to where I don't want to own it anymore. Um, and that maybe brings me to another element, crime. Now, it might not seem like it's so bad. The problem is usually the population is so small that it's hard to get an accurate gauge on what the crime rate actually is. So, in a big city, you have a big enough pool that you could say, okay, this much crime per this many people. Let's say that their metric is 100,000 people. If there's only 4,000 people, your gauge of 100,000 people is going to be really vague. And the crime is really specific too. There's a lot of situations where people just don't want you here. And so they will do their best to get rid of you. They'll intimidate you, they'll steal your stuff, they'll, burn your house down. This is a common thing to have people's houses burned down. And, all because they don't want you there, because you're in their backyard. And so that's a big thing. And then if you get farther south or closer into Albuquerque, there's a lot of gang crime that happens, and that it varies. So like farther south, from what I've heard talking to people that live down there, it tends to be more generalized. Like a lot of people experience it. People experience thefts and issues. In Albuquerque, it's weird because the gang crime tends to impact other people in gangs and people in drug trafficking and things like that. But in uh, at the same time, there's a lot of vagrancy, just people that are just down on their luck and they just steal to get by to survive. And we also have a lot of poverty, and um, I'm not one of these people that hates the poor because I've been very poor myself. I've been homeless. I've lived off grid in a shanty shack, and honestly, I don't mind living in a shanty shack, and I don't think there's that much wrong with it. But the kind of poverty that you have in like Albuquerque and Santa Fe is people that were born here quite often who were priced out of it but don't know where to go because it's one thing when the thing is we kind of are pushing towards California prices. So I have relatives in California, and I talked to them, and they said, you live in a pretty expensive place. And this is coming from someone. I just explained to them all my bills, what all my utilities cost, what my food bill is. We pretty moderate or pretty minimal food. And pretty cheap stuff. And we do everything we can to get just produce and local stuff. And I explained what our mortgage costs, and they said that you live in a really expensive place. Like your place is expensive, and that might be what's dragging you down financially. And in New Mexico, right? I make a decent income. If I took there's other places in the U.S. I was actually running the numbers and and I kind of know what numbers to look at, right? What food costs, what fuel costs. And, to live pretty similar to how I've been living the past 10 years, but with a better situation overall, um, I could probably live in California and come close to what I already do and be better off. I could probably live in Oregon and be better off. I might even be able to pull it off in Hawaii and actually be doing pretty well on what I spend to live in New Mexico because that's how expensive it's become here. In part just because we're so isolated and so, high elevation, isolated, inland, geographically isolated. It's not that far off from being in the middle of the ocean. It's just tough to get resources here. We are along a major freeway, and that does help. But the problem is that there's so much fuel. It takes so much fuel to get all of our resources here. By the time anything gets here, it's really expensive. So, um, and housing really expensive compared to even a few years ago. A lot. What I was kind of getting at with like the local homeless problem is that there are people that paid $300 a month for their home sometimes, and just the taxes on their home priced them out of keeping it, or the people that rented didn't own, you can't afford to pay your rent when your rent goes from 400 to 1,500 in one lease renewal, right? And so a lot of the people that you see wandering around are pissed off because they grew up here and now they can't live here because so many people have moved in. And it's a screwed up problem, right? Because those people are trying to escape another set of problems, but they've brought those problems with them for everybody else. And it's tough. There's a lot of issues. It's a beautiful place. I love it here, but in the end, I'm probably going to end up leaving eventually because it it isn't practical to keep living here, knowing what I know now about how sustainable it isn't to live here, and kind of being a younger person and looking for nicer things in life. Um, it's a really beautiful place if all you want to do is sit in your house and look at the beautiful view. But if you want to get out in your garden, grow some stuff, if you want to have social gatherings, if you want to have livestock of any kind, that's really not my interest. But if you want to have any livestock, um, and if you just enjoy being outdoors, um, it's weird. It's a tough place. You'd think it would be a place that, and a lot of people do go out. I spend a lot of time outdoors, but I'm more of an exception than the rule. The average New Mexican, last statistic I read was we spend an average of 30 minutes outdoors per day, which is lower than the national average of like 45 minutes or an hour or something like that. So we spend less time on average than the average American does outdoors. Um, and our food is on average more expensive, and our housing is pretty expensive, and we have a high rate of depression. We have pretty bad schools. I mean, the list goes on. There's a lot of negatives. When I talked about the positives, amazing culture, history, beautiful scenic vistas, beautiful landscapes. When the weather's good, it's really really good. It's beautiful weather when it's really nice, and I mean it's like peaceful and calm. We have a lot of space. If you want space, if you want to get away from other people, this is the place to be. Now the problem is I say that the moment I say that, the millisecond I say that on a video that I upload online, our population increases by 10 million. I mean, it's just how it is, unfortunately. So it's like the moment you advertise that fact, everybody comes and floods in and ruins it. The thing is, there's not enough water to support it, and so we kind of, the people I think that grew up here, we all kind of know that like people think this is going to grow a lot, and it might, but we do have a water problem that has to be solved first. And that is our first and foremost issue. I would say that if there's an issue that holds back New Mexico, it's water. We just don't have the benefit of large supplies of water like everybody else does. Sometimes Mother Nature is really kind to us and we get a huge downpour. Other times we get nothing. It's feast or famine out here in the desert, and I just hope you carefully consider. And I would say, just like anywhere else, just like the places I want to go to, which if you know me closely, you probably know where they are. It's probably a good idea to spend like a good couple of years, hanging around before you decide you're going to make the permanent movement. I know that's a tough thing to say. That's a tough decision. And it's a tall order, but I think you're better off before you transplant your whole life here and then end up having to abandon everything because you can't make it here. To just spend some time, experiment with it, decide if it's really for you. Because it's not for everyone, and it's tough sometimes. But I appreciate you watching this video. I appreciate your continued support and attention. Please share my videos with other people if they might find them interesting. Just a a dude rambling. And hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.